Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee because today we are going to be discussing the book of 1 Samuel. Hi, faithful listeners. Welcome to the Bible Explained podcast, where we are going to finish talking about 1 Samuel 30 today. And I got to be honest with you guys, I'm really enjoying 1 Samuel 30. I think it's been one of my favorite stories to talk about in a really long time in the Old Testament. So let's go ahead and grab our Bibles. And as always, I'll be reading out the WEB version or the World English Bible. But feel free to grab the version that you prefer, whatever that might be. And also grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea this morning. And I'll be reading 1 Samuel 30, 16 through 31. When he had brought him down, behold, they were spread around over all the ground, eating, drinking, and dancing, because of all the great plunder that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. David struck them from twilight even to the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped from there, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. There was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither plunder nor anything that they had taken. David brought them all back. David took all the flocks and the herds, which they had drove before those other livestock, and said, "This is David's plunder." David came back to the 200 men who were so faint that they could not follow David, whom also they had made to stay at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. When David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked men and worthless fellows of those who went with David answered and said, "Because they didn't go with us, we will not give them anything of the plunder that we have recovered, except to every man his wife and his children, that he may lead them away and depart." But David said, "Do not do so, my brothers. That which Yahweh has given to us, who has preserved us and delivered that troop that came against us into our hand. Who will listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays with the baggage. They shall share alike." It was so from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. When David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, even to his friends, saying, "Behold, a present for you from the plunder of Yahweh's enemies." He sent it to those who were in Bethel, to those who were in Ramoth of the south, to those who were in Jatir, to those who were in Aror, and to those who were in Siphmoth, to those who were in Eshtoma, and to those who were in Rachal, to those who were in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, to those who were in the cities of the Kenites, to those who were in Hormah, and to those who were in Borashan, to those who were in Athak, to those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men used to stay. So David had just come back from trying to fight a battle with the Philistines. Not against the Philistines, but with the Philistines, because don't forget that David was living in the land of the Philistines, and potentially David was starting to think of himself as a Philistine because he was living there for so long, and he was serving under King Achish, who was the king of the Philistines. And so David was trying to go to battle with King Achish, but Achish and the Philistines actually rejected David and all of David's men because David was a Hebrew. And the Philistines were like, "We don't want these Hebrews here, go home." So David's entire plan of going to try to fight a battle with the Philistines was totally fruitless. So David ended up going home. He had to travel 3 whole days to get back home to the city of Ziklag. But when David and his men returned to Ziklag, they see smoke instead of all of the buildings that were once there. And everything was gone. It was totally raided and destroyed, the entire city of Ziklag, where David and his men and his men's families had all lived. The families were totally gone. And so at this time, David's men were so angry with David that they were considering killing him. They were considering stoning him because of how mad they were. Probably because they had left the city of Ziklag pretty much defenseless for the time that they had to travel up to have that battle with the Philistines that ended up not really happening. So they were really mad at David. But David, instead of getting super discouraged He strengthened himself in Yahweh. He found his way back to God. And then he asked God a question. God, will I be able to recover everything that was lost in Ziklag? And God answered David immediately and said, yes, you will be able to recover it. So that's exactly what happens. David and his men, instead of going and fighting with the Philistines, go to fight against the Amalekites who had raided Ziklag. And it's very possible that David did not know who he was trying to fight against. It's very possible David had no clue that he was going out against the Amalekites. But what ends up happening is David meets this Egyptian man who was unconscious in a field. And so David took pity on him and fed him some food and regained this guy's strength. And so David was asking this guy, like, where are you from and what are you doing? Why were you collapsed out in a field? So the guy answers David, well, I'm a slave to an Amalekite and we were just making raids on the south and we also burned this city called Ziklag. And so David was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I needed to hear. So he asks this young slave to help him find the Amalekites. And the slave was like, absolutely, I'll help you find them as long as you don't kill me yourself and also you do not send me back to my terrible Amalekite master. So now, in verse 16, it says that when he had brought him down, meaning the slave brought David down to the Amalekite army, it says they were spread all around the ground, eating, drinking, and dancing because of the great plunder that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. So they were making all sorts of raids, not just against the Philistines, but against the land of Judah as well. And apparently they had had a lot of success because they were eating, drinking, and dancing all night long due to all the raiding and killing that they had just done. So now, these Amalekites who are not on guard are not expecting David and his men to come and wage war against them. Because don't forget that the Philistines were up more north trying to fight against the Israelites. But David, because he was not allowed to fight with the Philistines, was not there. And I'm sure that these Amalekites didn't know that, so they were feeling pretty secure with what they were doing right now. So David makes a sneak attack, and it says he struck them from twilight even to the evening of the next day, and not a single man of them escaped from there except for 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So about 400 Amalekites, or possibly slaves of the Amalekites, got away. They rode on the camels and fled from the scene. But everybody else died that night. And they probably died because they were hungover, first and foremost, or they were drunk. Because don't forget, they were having a big party. And on top of that, they were completely defenseless. They weren't expecting anybody to wage war against them. So David goes and finds his 2 wives. And it says that not only did David find his 2 wives, but it says that David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken. There was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither plunder nor anything else that they had taken. So not only did David recover all of the wives and children of his men, but he recovered more than that. He recovered all of the spoils from the raids that the Amalekites had done. And there was a lot there, is what it says. It wasn't just from Ziklag. The Amalekites were raiding all of the south, both the Judah and the Philistines. So all of this plunder suddenly falls into David's lap. So it says that David took all the flocks and the herds and all the other livestock, and he brought them all back. So now David is traveling back with everybody that he has recovered and all of the sheep and the plunder and everything that he got from those raids. And he meets the 200 men that were not able to go with him. Because the other thing that had happened was that 200 of David's 600 men were so weak from traveling that they weren't able to go to battle. Because David and his men had been traveling for a very, very long time, don't forget, because they had gone up north to try to do that battle with the Philistines. So they were traveling for probably close to 6 days with very little provisions. And then by the time they got to Ziklag, they couldn't refresh their provisions because Ziklag was burned to the ground. So there was 200 men that stayed behind with some of the baggage that David and his men were carrying. They stayed behind at this brook called Besor because they were too sick or weak to continue on. So David gets to the men, and it says that these 200 men went out to greet David and to meet the people who were with him. So can you imagine these men, these 200 men that were waiting for their wives and children to come back? This was a very, very happy moment for them when they see David arriving back with everybody and everything that was taken from them. So it was a very joyous occasion, except that some men tried to spoil it. Here's what it says in verse 22. All the wicked men and worthless fellows of those who went with David answered and said, because they didn't go with us, we will not give them anything of the plunder that we have recovered, except to every man his wife and his children, that he may lead them away and depart. So they're mad because these 200 men were too sick to go to battle. They're mad. They're like, we were the ones who got all this plunder. We did all the work. These guys did absolutely nothing. So we need to just give them back their wives and their kids and banish them. They don't deserve anything because they didn't go to war with us. But think about the Egyptian slave that had showed David where to go. The Amalekites had treated that Egyptian man almost the exact same way that these worthless men of David's were trying to treat the 200 men that were too sick to go to battle. Because don't forget, the young Egyptian man that was collapsed out in the field, he belonged to an Amalekite. And because he was too sick to travel, the Amalekite just left him for dead out in that field with no food or water or provisions, nothing. Left him for dead. And that's exactly what these men were trying to do to the 200 men who had stayed behind because they were too tired or sick to travel onward. And so David puts them in their place. He says, do not do this, my brothers, with that which Yahweh has given to us. So David puts them in their place by saying, look, this isn't our plunder. We didn't work for this. Yahweh gave this to us. So don't treat these 200 men as if they're worthless for not going to battle with us, because we ultimately did nothing. God gave us all of this. And so he brings them down to earth a little bit. And he says, he has preserved us, Yahweh has preserved us, and delivered the troop that came against us into our hand. So who will listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down to battle, so shall his share be who stays with the baggage. They shall share alike. So David's like, look, these 200 men, even though they were too weak to go to battle with us, they still had an important job of lightening our load and staying with the baggage and protecting all of our equipment that we had. They still did their share of the work. So we shouldn't be treating them as if they're nobodies and trying to banish them. And so David says, no, we are not going to do that. We are going to share this plunder with everybody. And so David made that a statute and an ordinance for Israel from that time forward, meaning that everybody who did their fair share of the work would get some of the plunder. So now David goes back to Ziklag and takes everybody with him. And it says that he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah and to his friends, saying, this is a present for you from the plunder of Yahweh's enemies. Now here's the thing. At the end of the last chapter and the beginning of this chapter, David was trying to go to battle with the Philistines, who were enemies of the Israelites. David was trying to go to battle, and God blocked David from doing that because David would have totally lost his reputation in Israel. And David needed a good reputation in Israel in order for him to be the next king, because we know that Saul is going to die very quickly. So if David is going to be a king, he obviously needs to have a very good reputation in order to become the next king. So can you imagine if God had not blocked David from fighting with the Philistines? David's reputation would have been gone like that, you know? And God did something so much better for David. Even though all of this was an absolutely terrible thing, God can work everything out for the good of those who love him. So God worked this entire situation out. Now David has a good reputation, because even though it's very possible that the Israelite elders knew that David was living with the Philistines at this point, they were receiving plunder from David as gifts, showing that David was not just becoming a Philistine and living a Philistine lifestyle. And this would have made David's reputation even better, probably with the Israelites. And don't forget that David knew none of this. He had no clue what was going on behind the scenes, what God was doing. David had no clue that Saul was going to die the very next day. David did not know what God was doing. So David wasn't sending these gifts to the Israelites trying to become the next king, knowing that Saul was going to die. David was just doing this to thank them, because here's what it says at the very end. He sent to everybody where David himself and his men used to stay. So he was sending gifts to his friends to thank them and to remind them that they were still friends. So all of this is really cool, the way God was just working things out. And David had to go through some very, very, very hard things through all of this. And I'm sure that he was like, I don't understand what God is doing. You know, God anointed me as king, and yet here I am being rejected by everybody, living with the Philistines. They don't even accept me. And now my family was taken from me in a raid against my hometown. I'm sure David was like, what is God doing in my life? But God was working behind the scenes, as he always does. So David's story is an encouragement to us that even though you and I are going through trials and hard things from time to time, it's not the end of the story. We cannot see what God is doing behind the scenes. So we have to have faith that God truly is working in our lives, because he really is. Okay, faithful listeners, this was one of my favorite couple episodes that I've done. I really enjoyed this chapter of 1 Samuel. This was so fun to talk about. So I hope you guys liked it as well. And if you did, share both episodes to your friends and family members who you might think need some encouragement if they are going through some trials. But faithful listeners, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. I'll see you on Monday, bright and early, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up and listen. Happy listening, and God bless.